If you have your Bibles, I encourage you to turn back to the passage that we had read earlier today, Luke 9:57 through 62. It's a short, simple, easy passage to read, and it is part of this series that we're doing called Follow Me, looking at all the places in the New Testament where we find that particular phrase, follow me. And in particular, this one is just say, follow me to be my disciples. Now, it should go without saying that in order to be one of Jesus's disciples, that, well, you have to follow Jesus instead of, say, following someone else. Now, let's say if you were to follow Buddha, as many do, you wouldn't end up being one of Jesus's disciples, even if you ended up thinking well of Jesus and were even open to learning a couple of things from Jesus. You just end up being wherever Buddha ended up if you were following him, and you wouldn't end up where Jesus ended up, which we are told that he ended up preparing a place for those who follow him, and he's going to come back and lead us to be with him in that place, which is in God's presence. We often sometimes refer to that as heaven. So if you just have to follow Jesus if you want to end up where Jesus ends up, right? I mean, it's pretty simple. It was Jesus who said, you know, you can't serve two masters. You're going to love one, you're going to hate the other. But have you ever asked yourself when you've heard that phrase, and it's a common phrase we study in the church, why is that so? Why do you end up loving one and hating the other? It's also a simple, easy answer. It's because each master will have a different view about how to understand the world and what is true and isn't true. They will also have a different view about what is important and the kind of choices that you need to make if you want to end up going where they are headed. That's why Jesus said that you can't serve both God and mammon. Now, mammon was the name of a god of wealth and riches. I mean, if you tried to follow the God of the Bible and the mammon God, if you said, hey, I'm going to follow both of these, they're both going to be my master, well, you'd have to decide which worldview you liked best. And if you like the view of having, well, a lot of build-up of earthly treasures, you might love the God of mammon because that's what he was all about. And you might not like hearing Jesus say that we need to build up a treasure in heaven instead. You might love one and end up hating the other. You really can't serve two masters. That is, you can't follow more than one person. And I hope that it ends up being Jesus that you follow. Just as a reminder, the term disciple, and this is really a discipleship series that we're in the New Testament, is the word mathetes. We get the word Matthew from it. You've got a nice name. Matthew just means a learner, a disciple, someone who wants to learn. It indicates a person is a learner, that a person is a student, that a person is a pupil, a practitioner. It means that they want to learn. Now, it doesn't mean what they learn. It just means the kind of person they are. They like to learn things. They want to learn things. And I hope that if you are a disciple, that you want to learn from Jesus, from all the people that you could learn from. When Jesus used this particular word to describe a person who was learning from him, it indicated that they were not just learning information to earn some sort of a degree. His disciples learned, as I indicated earlier, how the person they were following thought and understood the world. And Jesus would say, hey, what I'm trying to help you understand about the world is the truth about the world. And so for following Jesus, we're going to come to understand how he understands the world around us, and how learning that, how he understands, will lead us to make the same sort of choices that Jesus made. Could we have the same understanding? We're watching him. He's in front of us. And so we're going to be following him, making his kind of decisions, living his kind of life, and ending up where he ended up. Sounds good, right? But you know, one of the problems is that most people are sort of pragmatic. I mean, we like the idea of following Jesus. We like the idea of ending up where he's going to end up. But, you know, some of us want to know, well, Jesus, if I end up following you, is it really going to help me face with the daily issues that I face with? I mean, I got a lot of stuff going on in my life, and I just want to know if I'm following you, if I'm going to be able to deal with these issues in a good sort of way. We are sort of pragmatic in our choice about who we're going to follow because, man, if they say that this is how you ought to live so that you have these good results, then we might give it a shot because we want those good results. We want to know how following Jesus will make our life better. We want to know how following him will help us deal with these situations. We want to know how, well, if I have a conflict, will following Jesus help me deal with conflicts? How will following Jesus help me with my marriage, or help me raise my kids, or help me get a promotion at work? I mean, if I'm going to follow Jesus, I got all these things that I want to have happen, and how will following him help me get what I want? They're the sort of questions we ask because, well, there's a part of us that buys into that age-old wisdom that the destination of the information train is application. If we're going to learn from Jesus, we want to apply it to our life, and we want to be able to have these good things happen for us. The question is Jesus really leading us to the things that we want? Or is he leading us to the things that he wants? If you know anything about Jesus, then you know that there's an answer to that question, generally speaking as well. Following Jesus is going to show you how to love yourself. It's going to help you love the people around you, like your spouse and your kids and your neighbors and anyone else you might bump into. And it's going to teach you how to love God in all situations. Jesus' disciples are, after all, supposed to be known as people who love. We're supposed to be known by our love. If you're following Jesus and someone looks at your life and they see how you're dealing with the people around you, and it doesn't matter where you're at or when you're at it, if they see you dealing with people, you know what their impression is they're supposed to walk away from? Man, that guy knows how to love. That guy really knows how to love. He knows how to love his spouse. She knows how to love her husband. They know how to love their kids know how to love him. I mean, that should be the go-away. So if someone is watching you and they see the way you're interacting with people and they say, I don't know about that. That didn't look real loving. It might be an indication that maybe you're not really following Jesus. You just think you are. You're really following someone else. You know, are there other options for us to follow? Absolutely. There are all kinds of people who are encouraging us to follow them. They will make the claim that if we follow them, our life will be better. But only following Jesus will really make your life better and make it better for the people around you. And only following Jesus will lead you to heaven. There's no other way. Even back in Jesus' day, he was not the only one who had disciples. Not the only one who had people wanting to learn from him. The most notable person in the Bible who had people wanting to learn from him was John the Baptist. Now, John came first. He was supposed to prepare people to receive the Messiah. As we learned last week, some of Jesus' own disciples, like James and John and Peter and Andrew, were originally some of John's disciples. And John pointed to Jesus and basically said, hey, he's the guy that you need to be following, not me. In fact, I'm going to be following him. And so he tried to get his disciples to start following Jesus because that was the way. In fact, Jesus would say, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. One of John's disciples actually came to him one time. He says, hey, John the Baptist, we got a problem. These Jesus disciples, they're actually baptizing more people than we're baptizing, and we need to do something about this. There's a problem here, John. What are we going to do about it? And John said, we're not going to do anything about it. This is not a competition. This is God's plan. The whole plan is for us to prepare people to go and be a part of him and follow Jesus. That's what we're supposed to do. Now, there was a time when John even had his own questions. He'd been sending all of his disciples to follow Jesus. He was in prison for preaching the bad news about sin. And he was wondering, man, did I make a mistake? Did I send people to follow the wrong guy? And his disciples went and told Jesus, says, hey, John the Baptist is wondering if he made a mistake about you. And Jesus said, go back and tell him what you see. Tell him about the blind who receive sight and the prisoners who are set free. Go and tell him about the things that I am doing in my ministry. And when that news came back to John, he's like, he is the one. He was the right one. He's the Messiah. He's doing the things that God said his son would do. The 12 disciples that Jesus invited to follow him, as we studied last week, would not only become fishers of men, but they would become the witnesses of everything that Jesus said and did. They were with him from the very beginning, from his baptism all the way through his resurrection and ascension. They recorded it, they preserved it, they proclaimed it, they passed it along so that we who didn't see those things could come to believe and we could come to follow Jesus too. Now, those 12 disciples, as we studied last week, had a unique invitation to a unique ministry. And to accomplish it, they had to learn an awful lot. But they were not the only ones who Jesus would invite to follow him. And they were not the only ones that Jesus would send out to preach that the kingdom of God is at hand. And our scripture talks about that. In chapter 10 of Luke's Gospel, which is after the chapter we're looking at today, it's recorded that Jesus sent out 70 followers. 70 followers. He sent them out in pairs who would go ahead of him into every city and every place where he would eventually visit. The 12 were a part of that 70. These places were primarily in Galilee. We're not told exactly where they are. Probably some in Samaria, some in Judea as well. And these 70 went out to preach. And it was to these 70 that Jesus was about to send out that he said, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, beseech the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest." Evidently, 70 preachers wasn't enough. I don't know how you would feel about 70 preachers showing up. But you might say, sounds like plenty. In fact, one might be more than enough. We don't need 70 of these guys around here. But Jesus looked at the task that he wanted of them going forth and going to all these cities and preparing people to know about him before he arrived. And he thought, 70 isn't enough. In fact, geographically speaking, they weren't going to a very big area. Population-wise, there weren't that many people. It seems like 70 was plenty to cover all of the cities. But Jesus had this sense of urgency about the endeavor he was sending these 70 to go do. He was like a farmer, and he was looking out, and his crops were ready. And he was saying, now's the time. We got to do the harvest now. We got to go now. A farmer wants to send out every possible person into their fields when it's time to get the harvest in. They don't want to risk a storm coming in, or they don't want it to get ripe, or all the problems that can happen. If it's time to harvest, you go and you get it now, because now is when it's ready. You ask any farmer and they will tell you, I could always use one more worker, or maybe 10 more workers. In fact, if I had 100 workers, I'd send them all out there and we'd get this thing done fast. It's time to harvest. I used to help a friend farm his cotton when I was in Lubbock. I didn't do it very often, but I got the opportunity to help him. Sometimes I ran what I called a packer, this great big machine, and they'd throw all the cotton in it, and you'd pack it down in these great big loaves that sat out in the field, and then they get picked up and taken to the gym. It was kind of fun getting all of that picked up. Other times I would run the stripper that picked it up and put it in that great big packer thing. Sometimes we just worked on broken implements that just weren't working. He goes, yeah, let's go work. Oh, the tractor's not working. And so we spent all day taking care of that. I didn't help a lot, but I helped when he asked me to help. You see, when he really needed help, it seems that he didn't always have the help that he needed. I mean, there were a lot of people he knew who were able to run tractors and run packers and do things a whole lot better than I would have been able to do it. But whenever he needed to do it, he needed help right then. Now, when he asked me if I might be available to help him in his harvest, I didn't understand anything about cotton. I didn't know that you went out to get cotton based on humidity, not based on when the sun was up or down. And so it was time to go harvest sometimes like in the middle of the night. I mean, like in the middle, like the wee mornings of the night, well after midnight, we have lights going on, all kinds of stuff. Hey, let's go do this. And there are a few times that I got to go and do that. And, whenever it's ready, he would call. And I'm sure there were other people he could call. But they weren't available. They had other stuff that was going on. I mean, some of them just wanted to sleep. You get the idea of what Jesus was talking about. Now, just to let you know, if my friend was using me, a preacher, to go into the harvest of a cotton field, then he would have used any able and willing hand. It wasn't because I had special skills. It was because I had availability and a willingness to go when it was time to go. Because not everyone was able to go. Which leads us to our text, back in chapter 9, at the end of that chapter, where Jesus was once again going down a road. But this time, unlike last week where he was going away from Jerusalem, this time he's going to Jerusalem. Jesus and those following him had just passed through a Samaritan village on their way to Jerusalem. And that Samaritan village realized that this was a bunch of Jewish people and they were on their way to Jerusalem, and they weren't real happy about it. And so they basically told them, we don't have any place for you to stay here. You're going to Jerusalem? Just keep on going. And now, if you remember, there was a little animosity between Jewish people and Samaritans. Sometimes the Jewish people were not very nice to the Samaritans, and sometimes the Samaritans were not very nice to the Jewish people, and this was one of them. Well, it was at this time that a couple of Jesus' disciples, James and John, remember they had been John the Baptist's disciples, now they're Jesus' disciples, now they're learning to be fishers of men disciples, and they just got this refusal by these Samaritans, and they asked Jesus, hey Jesus, do you want us to command fire from heaven to consume those guys? And evidently, when they asked that question, it's pointed out in the scriptures that are just in the previous chapter, that they had forgotten their identity as being disciples of Jesus. Jesus actually says, hey, I'm going to be making you fishers of men, not destroyers of men. Did you not get the memo? We're not doing what you want to do. That's how the old people would have acted. That's not how my disciples would act. Remember, his disciples are going to be known by love. And Jesus had to remind them of that perspective. And so Jesus gave them a constant reminder of their failure to keep their focus on being one of Jesus' disciples. Because you know what, guys? I'm going to start calling you the sons of thunder. Now, I recently learned, because my son and daughter-in-law are both pilots in the Air Force, that they get these really cool call signs. Have you ever, those call signs they put on their helmet, stuff like that? They always sound like a really cool thing. Like my daughter-in-law is Spartan. I go, that's kind of a cool name. Get to be a Spartan. My son is Maul, Darth Maul, a great invader guy. Those are cool names. But they have told me that all of those names have a backstory. And even though they sound cool to everyone else, those backstories remind them of something dumb that they did. So that every time they hear this call sign, it's a constant reminder to have a little humility. It's a constant reminder to not think more of themselves than they ought to think, even though everyone else thinks the sign just sounds like a cool name. Google Sons of Thunder, and you'll find a variety of references to movies about superheroes, about people who, it really is for a lot of people kind of a cool name. Now, for us in the church, not so much, because we know the backstory. We know that the reason they got that name was because they'd done something stupid. They wanted to destroy instead of to fish. What about you? I mean, if Jesus was going to pick out something dumb in your life and give you a nickname to remind you to have humility, what would be your nickname? Jesus was on this journey to Jerusalem, still inviting men to be among those he was about to send out to preach the kingdom of God. He was still building up that 70. He wanted as many disciples as he could, but there were only 70. There are some translations that say 72, but that's only 2 more. But he wanted even more than that. But not everyone who said, hey, I'm ready to follow and I'm going to follow you. Give me a call and I'm going to go. they weren't really ready when Jesus wanted them to be ready to go. Luke tells us that as they continued this journey, they ran across 3 different people that fit that category. He said, one guy came to us and said, "You know, Jesus, I will follow you wherever you go." Hey, have you ever been in that place where you can say those kinds of words? Matthew in his gospel referred to this guy as a scribe. And now Luke doesn't mention this about him, but evidently he was a scribe. A scribe was someone whose profession, because they could read and write, was to record contracts, to preserve history, to assist political and religious leaders in their business affairs, because not everyone back then could write. Very few people could. It was a highly desired skill. Scribes were used for sort of working for the bosses in their society. In Israel, they often became the expert in the law of Moses because they were primarily employed by the religious leaders in Israel, because they were both religious and civil leaders, and they were in charge of everything in life. The Sadducees and the Pharisees both employed people who were scribes. And that means that scribes primarily lived in larger places like Jerusalem. And because they were sort of important people, they were used to being awarded very well for their services. They were paid very well. They were used to having creature comforts because, they were a highly skilled professional and they got paid for it. And they were around the people who were in charge, and they were used to being taken care of. And they liked that lifestyle, and so they had a strong desire to, take care of those people who employed them. They had learned that old wisdom that you don't bite the hand that feeds you. And so they really did do and sort of became the experts of the law, and they had a high standard of living. They were professionals. Jesus, however, wasn't so sure that this professional scribe was really up to his declaration to follow him wherever he was going to go. In fact, he points out to the scribe, don't you understand where I'm headed? You say you want to follow me, but don't you know anything about me? Even if we brought it to the most basic level, foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man, which is a messianic reference to himself, I don't even have anywhere to lay my head. We don't know whether the scribe ended up among the 70, but most scholars don't think he did. He's usually thought of as having gone away sad, as did the rich young ruler who was told to go and give away all that he possessed before following Jesus. Jesus was saying, you're going to have to make a lot of changes in your life to follow me. And I don't see that in your future. I don't see you willing to give up your creature comforts and your position and your notoriety in order to really follow me. I see you wanting to keep all of those things and follow me. In other words, Jesus was saying, I see that you have 2 masters here, and I don't think it's going to work out well. When Jesus sent out the 70, he would instruct them not to take anything and to depend entirely upon the generosity of those who offered it, and to make do without it whenever it wasn't offered. It's difficult to give up our creature comforts, isn't it? It's difficult to give up our self-importance. But it's vital if we want to follow Jesus and go into the harvest when he calls us to go into the harvest. Luke also records that Jesus said to another person, follow me. Don't you want to hear that from Jesus? You follow me. And how that person responded by saying, Lord, just permit me to first go and bury my father. I mean, that sounds like a reasonable request, doesn't it? But Jesus was about to send out his 70. There was sort of a timeline. It was about to happen. He needed people to be able to go right now. And he wanted them to do it. And so Jesus' words to this man sound a little harsh. Jesus reveals in his answer to this man kind of a reality check. Those who had buried this man's father were dead, just like the father was. That is, they were dead in their sins. And they were going to be dead in the grave when it came their time, and there would be no hope of resurrection for them. I think that's why Jesus told him, just let the dead bury the dead. Those who would take care of his Father needed to hear the offer of life that only Jesus could make, an offer that those Jesus was about to send out into to the cities would be able to proclaim to a bunch of dead people. Dead in their sins people. They needed to hear that, and Jesus was wanting someone to go and do them. And so as important it was to go and be with his family and bury his father, Jesus was saying it's more important for them to hear the gospel. And I need you to go and do that. Again, we don't know what this man chose to do. We're only presented with what we see as a dilemma. But for Jesus, there was no dilemma. The answer to his invitation to follow was, in Jesus' perspective, an easy one. But it's not always from our perspective, right? Which is why we need to learn how Jesus sees things, to learn from him so we can understand his perspective of reality and realize that it's so very important and understand the urgency about it. In our Sunday school time, we looked at Bartimaeus, the guy who was blind and calls out for mercy from Jesus. And Jesus heals his blindness. And he uses the phrase to say, you're made whole. And we talked about the dynamic of what did Jesus give this guy? He got his sight back. But he doesn't have his sins forgiven. Every person that Jesus healed was going to face death. Even Lazarus, who was raised from the dead, would have to face the grave again. And there's only one good news that comes from Jesus about extending beyond the grave to live with God forever. And we need to hear that, and it's more important than anything else. There's urgency to it. Luke said that another man to whom Jesus said, "Follow me," said that he'd do so, but first he wanted to say goodbye to those who were at home. And again, that doesn't seem like an unreasonable request. You know, we talked last week about Peter and Andrew and James and John leaving their nets and just taking off and following him. We didn't talk about home. We know Peter was married. We know there was a home, there were wives. Now we do hear through the scriptures that a lot of those wives ended up preparing for them when they came through and taking care of them and serving them and feeding them. But man, wives, what would you do if your husband just didn't show back up one day? You might be going, hey, what's going on here? Why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you at least send me a text? You know, it seems a bit unreasonable. Especially when you compare it to how Levi, we know as Matthew, how Levi, one of the 12, is allowed to go back and say goodbye. In fact, he was allowed to go back to his home and throw a party. He got to invite all of his friends over to it, and Jesus was going to get to be there. And it's even sometimes used as an evangelization model, saying, hey, this is a good idea. Look at Levi. He got to go back. He got to throw this party. He invited his friends to come meet Jesus. Maybe you could do the same thing to invite your lost friends to some kind of a party to meet Jesus. What a great way to do that. But this man that Jesus was talking to didn't get that sort of opportunity. Jesus tells this man, no one, after putting his hand to the plow and looking back, is fit for the kingdom of God. There's an urgency in Jesus' invitation to these would-be disciples because Jesus really was facing a deadline. It was time, and it seems like within days, that Jesus was going to send out these 70. Jesus wanted these disciples to go out. He wanted them to go immediately. He wanted them to pave the way for his arrival. There was no time to be wasted. And the next thing that Luke reports, if you carry on in his story, is how these 70 that Jesus found went out into the harvest. We read about Jesus' directions to them and their success stories. One of them came back reporting, Jesus, you're not going to believe it. Even the demons are subject to your name. But the biggest sign of their success was that everywhere Jesus went from that point forward, after these guys went out and preached, were these enormous, huge crowds. You always wonder where the crowds come from. Well, essentially, Jesus created them. He sent out preachers to tell everybody about who he was and what he was going to be able to do and the kinds of things that were going to happen. And the people were prepared to hear about Jesus. So anytime they heard about him, they're like, let's go see if this is true. Let's go see if this is right. They were ready to encounter the living Lord. The work that Jesus sent these disciples to do, well, it's been done. Which leads us to the question, was Jesus' invitation to them, this group of 70 going out to this specific ministry, along with the urgency of it needs to be done and it needs to be done now because he's ready to go to these villages, is that same urgency in the invitation that Jesus gives us to go into the fields that are ripe for harvest? Some would say, no, it's not. Pointing out that it's obviously a unique invitation for a unique opportunity that has come and gone, that's already taken place, and it's really not for us. But others would argue that in Jesus' invitation to these 70 disciples, a more general invitation comes to us for all people who have lived in all ages. They would argue that the time is now for us to preach the gospel, that there is nothing more important for a person to hear the gospel and respond to it. They would argue that Jesus is still inviting his followers to go out in his name to prepare people, as did the 70, to hear Jesus, to encounter Jesus, and to respond to Jesus when he gives them the offer of salvation. If so, then we who say that we follow Jesus, we need to do so with urgency. We need to share the good news with people who need to hear it at the point when they are willing to learn it, when they are ripe for harvest. But we face those same issues that these other disciples faced. Man, we are so busy. We've got so many commitments. We've got so many important things that we need to do. And when we choose to take care of these things, it means that we're not going to be available to Jesus when he needs us because we've got more important things to do. I want you to consider right now that there may be someone who is at this very moment ready to hear the gospel. They may be at this point where they are open to hearing it in a way in which they would respond to it. And Jesus is aware of that readiness. He's aware of that ability where they're sort of ripe for harvest. And Jesus is saying, I need to get one of my disciples to go and be with this person and share the gospel to them because they're ready for it. In fact, there might be more than one. There might be 10 or 20 or thousands of them. The fields really are, as Jesus said, ripe for harvest with these kinds of people. The problem is not that people aren't ready. The problem is with the workers. We're not ready to go when he wants us to go. Now, to be fair, as was brought up earlier in our service, there are plenty of disciples who are more than willing to go on our own terms, in our own way, in our own places. And we're willing to do it when we want to do it, when it's convenient for us, which might mean that we might miss that important meeting that Jesus is trying to get us to. We might end up talking with people who are not ready at all because it's on our time and not his time. I've come to call these meetings of getting together divine appointments. I had the opportunity of having a few of them this week. Times when I was in the right place at the right time to share the gospel, and I recognized it as such and realized its importance and pushed that forward and did that even though the list of things I had to do did not get done. But something more important took place. I'd like to say that I'm always available, but the truth is I'm not. I let things get in the way. My importance, my pride, my schedule, and things that I think are so vastly important. And I miss the opportunities that God has to bring me into a divine appointment where I get to be one of his workers in the field for harvest. I'll be honest with you. When Jesus sets up a divine appointment, he needs a disciple who is ready and able to show up at it. And if we're not ready, he'll use someone who is. They might be few and far between, but he'll use those who are ready. In that sense, the workers are still few. For most of us are just far too busy to accept Jesus' invitation to go. How can you know whether you're ready or not? Well, could you pray this prayer? Lord Jesus, I will follow you, starting right now, never looking back, to go where you want me to go, making disciples for you. I will do it. Count on me. Can you pray that prayer? I served a church when we used to sing an old hymn, I'll go where you want me to go. It's an old hymn, easy to sing, hard to follow. I noticed when we were singing it one time that one of our elders never sang that particular song. We were a very small group, so it was pretty easy. Now, you couldn't tell that he was singing by his voice anyways, because he didn't make much noise when he was singing. But you could see his lips moving, so I knew he was singing. I just couldn't hear it. And I noticed that every time we sang this song, we sang it pretty often because we were a pretty small church and we were trying to reach out and we were hoping to grow and we wanted to meet people and bring them to the Lord. And it was very strong in our DNA of that church. And so I finally asked him, I said, hey, I noticed that when we sing this song, your lips don't move. He's like, yeah, I guess you caught me. He said, I can't sing that song. So, you know, if I sang that song, it'd just be a lie. He says, you know, I like where I'm at. Like what I'm doing. I'm comfortable. I've got a good thing going here. I want God to use me here, not there. And I'm really not willing to go wherever he wants me to go, whenever he wants me to go. I wish I was. I don't know if he really wished he was or if he just wanted to get rid of his guilt. There was also a woman in that church at the same time who sang that song with gusto. And whenever she retired from teaching at school, she felt God's call to go to a place that she didn't really know anything about. She's been there for well over 20 years now. She's teaching full time at an orphanage in Haiti. That's where she ended up going. And that's to whom she's ended up sharing her faith with in her retirement years. She and her husband were pretty well off. She could have retired really comfortably. She could have lived a life of ease trying to figure out how God could use her where she was at. Thank you very much, God. But she heard God and she responded to it. Two very different responses from the same small group of people. What about me? Are you ready to go into the harvest when Jesus wants you to go? Where Jesus wants you to go into it? Are you open to the divine appointments, whether here or there? Are you willing to be sent to share the gospel at a moment's notice? Is it really that important? Do you share that urgency? If not, then what needs to change so that you can be ready and willing to go and make disciples of those who are wanting to hear it? Are you really ready to start following him? We're going to have a hymn of invitation. And at the very least, I hope you can follow what Jesus asked, and you can pray that workers are available to enter the harvest. Would you please stand?